to RICHO and Jones.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Look, last night we nearly had a walk out here. There's a bit of a confrontation between my colleague and some of the staff. Last night with Peter, I made reference to the fact that everything that happens now seems to be climate change. Kids in schools are being brainwashed. Parents don't seem willing to strike back. Universities fill the heads of their students with global warming rubbish. The corporate world is virtually exercising a form of blackmail. Superannuation funds say if this particular corporation or that particular corporation doesn't have a climate change strategy, we won't invest. And the mayors of places like Glen Innes and Lismore are screaming global warming. But over a century of data from the Bureau of Meteorology shows they're making the stuff up. As a rule of thumb, when an alarmist claims the scientists say or read the science, they've got no clue what they're talking about and they're just regurgitating nonsense, or as Donald Trump would say, fake news. As I've said over and over again, carbon dioxide, because that's what they say the problem is, coal-fired power produces carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is 0.04% of the atmosphere. That's the whole world. Human beings through everything. Eating, breathing, breaking wind, cows, manufacturing. Human beings are responsible for only 3% of that 0.04%, whole world. And then little old Australia, it's responsible for 1.3% of the 3% of the 0.04%. As John McEnroe, the tennis player, would scream, "You can't be serious." Well, it gets worse. As Craig Kelly, the courageous federal MP for the Liberal seat of Hughes, I say courageous because dare open your mouth here and you'll get buried, and they've tried to bury him. He indicated last Friday during the House Economics Committee's ongoing review of the banking industry that the CEO of the National Australia Bank, NAB, this bloke Cronican, confirmed that from 2035, thank God he won't be around then, the NAB was going to blackball all loans to the Australian thermal coal industry. Under questioning, Mr Cronican admitted that the NAB would lend to the porn industry to produce X-rated videos, but would not lend to support Australian jobs in the thermal coal industry. The bank was, quote, cooperating within a government framework on the Paris Accord. Well, Craig Kelly was too smart to swallow all of this. And as he wrote, quote, "This is an admission that the decision has nothing to do with economics. The excuse is BS, which stands for bull." The Australian government commitments under the Paris Accord are 26 to 28% reductions in emissions from 2005 levels by the year 2030. The government puts no, this is Craig Kelly speaking, the government puts no requirement upon the banks to stop lending to the thermal coal industry. Yet this bloke Cronican said to a parliamentary committee that the bank was, quote, operating within a government framework on the Paris Accord. Mr Cronican, you're talking rubbish. Some would say you're speaking untruths. Now remember, when the thermal coal is exported, the emissions are counted in the country where the coal was used. And Mr Cronican, typical of corporate ignorance, is before the Parliament's Economics Committee. He didn't even know what Australia's carbon dioxide emissions targets were under the Paris Agreement. What he mistakenly quoted was Labor's policy, taken to the election, of a 45% economy-wide reduction as being Australia's policy. This was rejected by the public at the last election. So here are this mob, along with a number of other corporations, practising this virtue signalling. What do they call it today? Woke virtue signalling. God, I hate that word. It's an adjective, really, meaning alerting people to injustices in society. We're meant to stay angry, stay woke. We're sick of the word, aren't we?
I am. I think it's a... Oh, well, I was about to say bull something word. I don't get into trouble again. So I better shut up tonight.
With Labor language?
No.
Labor language?
No, I wouldn't do it. No,
you do. You use it at home.
Okay, it's done. It's out there. What can I say?
It's out there. Craig has joined us, Craig Kelly. Well, where do we go from here?
Well, Alan, my concern is what we're seeing some of these major companies in Australia simply appeasing this noisy green element to try and get them off their back. And they're doing serious harm to the Australian economy, not so much today, but in the years down the track. The idea that we would give up on thermal coal by 2035 is absurd. Now, you know, no one has a crystal ball to know what the situation will be like in 2035, but the International Energy Agency are the very best judge of this. Now, they put a report out early last week that says by 2035, their estimates are, their forecasts are, on the announced policies, which a lot of countries cutting back, will be exporting more thermal coal in 2035 than we will today. And you've got the National Bank of Australia saying no to thermal coal, but under question is saying they're happy to go on loan to the porn industry.
But hang on, before we go to there, operating his words within a government framework on the Paris Accord. There's nothing in the government framework. Yeah, but there's nothing in the government saying you can't lend to the thermal coal.
Look, he's just going to be making this stuff up to appease this noisy, and I hate the word woke, sort of minority that are making a lot of noise. Now,
but does he have a genuine fear that in some way his company's going to be boycotted by people? Because we've had all these threats of boycotts.
That's what you said, eh? Stop Extinction Rebellion from parking themselves outside a National Australia Bank, so buy off their opposition.
That's, I mean, this is blackmail, but it's working. What worries me, Craig, is that it works.
Well, the real concern is, Richo, if you're living in a regional town in New South Wales or Queensland that relies upon thermal coal mining to run your town, whether you've got a small business in town or in the transport industry, your operation and the house that you've got, your family, the school where the kids go, all that is underwritten by the thermal coal operation. Now, why should those people go and bank with the National Bank if they're going to sell them out, if the message is we're going to sell you out in 2035?
Well, just coming back to your point, the World Outlook 2019, that's an official international document, published last week by the International Energy Agency, this is the point that Craig made, forecasts that under current stated policies, the use of thermal coal to generate electricity will be higher in 2035 than it is today. So, as you say, this mob are now saying, oh, we won't have anything to do with it. So if we don't, just supposing we don't, just supposing the NAB prevails, do you think China are going to stand by or Brazil are going to stand by? No.
Or India.
Or India. They'll get their coal from somewhere else. How does that help our economy?
Well, it does a double thing effect. First thing, it harms the Australian economy, but what it also does, if you really believe it's important to reduce CO2 emissions, you want to export as much Australian coal as you can because that displaces the coal from India and from China. The coal that India and China burn is much dirtier in terms of particulate emissions and also CO2
gas content's way higher.
And sulphur. The mining of the Chinese coal uses a lot more emissions than Australian coal. So every tonne of Australian coal we export to replace Indian and Chinese coal is actually benefiting the CO2 equation. And yet they're not even looking at this.
Well, now, we're looking at the national interest, aren't we, in all of these things?
Hope so.
You hope so. So here we are, if this is an outfit, this is a leading entity, the National Australia Bank, and they're virtually preaching this stuff, which universities pick up and schools pick up and everyone else picks up, which is going to jeopardise the economic well-being of this country. In other words, we're not going to export the stuff because they can... I mean, even at the moment, if someone wants to stick in money for a coal-fired power station to generate cheap electricity, they're going to struggle to get money from the banks, which is one of the reasons you're saying the government is going to have to build this coal-fired power station.
It's the second biggest bank. Well, what do? We guarantee the banks. I mean, they do pretty well out of government.
Yeah.
Look, that's right, Alan. We have to... Now, these banks and these other large companies have really got to take a look at themselves. If they're just going to sit back and appease this noisy minority, and remember, the people that are doing this all on the company boards now, by 2035, they'll all be gone. They'll all be superannuated and retired, living off the earnings of the company from years before. They'll be gone, and there'll be other people in there to implement these decisions. Now, we've got to make sure that as Australian companies are putting policies forward that benefit the Australian nation.
Let me just say something here. This is very, very, very serious stuff. Now, Terry McCrann, who Graham knows, I know, he's one of the most formidable economic commentators in this country for many years. He wrote 2 days ago, last week's bushfires haven't only figuratively fried brains right around the country, and especially in the Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra triangle, they've also arguably singed the media's Your Right to Know campaign. Terry McCrann said such a campaign rests on trust, that the media can be trusted to report fairly and fully, relatively calmly and accurately, and not to enthusiastically pump out dishonesty, distortion and hysteria. Now, he's referring to the fact that all through the bushfires, we've been told it's climate change, it's climate change, it's climate change. This is in preschools, this is in primary schools, this is in secondary schools, this is in universities, when everybody knows you've got fuel on the floor, and if you've got fuel, you've got fire. If you don't have fuel, you don't have a fire. Now, here we've got a bloke from the National Australia Bank virtually stepping into line, arguing the same thing as the Extinction Rebellion mob.
That's right. Whose side are they on? Maybe they want to be the bankers to Extinction Rebellion.
Well, Terry McCrann